clearly Volcker had an enormous career. He served under 6 presidents, both Republican and Democrat, and served to really change the way the US handles monetary policy. What will be his most outstanding legacy?
Well, I think you're spoilt for choice, because he was involved in some of the key landmark events in global economics of the last 50 years, really. If you even go back to 1971 and the US decision to leave the gold standard, which led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, which had defined the global financial system after World War II. He was a close advisor to the President Nixon in making that decision when he was at the US Treasury. He then burst onto the scene again as the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the late 70s and early 80s, with a complete change in philosophy by the central bank, a much tougher approach to inflation, which led to nearly 20% official interest rates, hard to believe now, hard to remember, at a time when inflation was also in the high double digits, and helped cause a recession, which many people will always remember him for. But that he started that tough anti-inflation central bank policy, which arguably brought in the 80s and 90s that long period of relatively shallow recessions and modest inflation. You know, the financial crisis, in a sense, marked the end of that period, which he helped very dramatically to produce. And he then was part, as you suggested, part of the sort of cleanup when he was working for President Obama with that analysis of some of the things that had led to the crisis, the risk-taking, if you like, and that Volcker Rule, which was supposed to sort of rein in the speculative activities of investment banks. So, you know, a swathe of influence which continued really until his dying months, I would say.
It's a good job we didn't have Twitter when inflation was as high as that. In some ways, though, his legacy as well is high asset prices.
Yes.
And in some ways, he has created, by that, some of the crises we now face.
Yeah, and that is one of the things when we talk about, and Mervyn King, the former governor of the Bank of England, used to talk about the nice decade. We had this period where macroeconomists were kind of clapping themselves on the back, saying we now have low inflation, we have growth. But that very stability of the system made it possible for people to take more and more risk, take on more and more debt, particularly in the financial sector. And I think he recognised that more than many people, and indeed had resisted some of President Reagan's efforts to deregulate in the 80s. It was only after he left the Fed that under Clinton and others you had more financial regulation that he was unhappy about, and I guess arguably some of those fears came true.
He had something called the Saturday Night Special, Stephanie. That was how he began to combat inflation. Tell us exactly what the Saturday Night Special was.
And I have to say, I sometimes think of that and of him when we have our debates around the how much the Fed is listening to the markets and how worried it might be in the lead up to a meeting at spooking the markets, because he had exactly the opposite approach. So he came in against the opposition of many of the senior people on the FOMC at that time and the Fed, the interest rate setting committee, and announced in a press conference a few months after he came in that he was going to start targeting the money supply and basically have a much tougher approach to inflation. This was opposed by many people at the Fed, and it led to times when the Fed was increasing interest rates by perhaps 2 percentage points at a time without warning the market at all. I mean, the exact opposite of what we would do now with the very careful, we would tend to blame the Fed, criticise the Fed if it hadn't in advance told the markets exactly, in effect, what it was going to do. He had a very different approach.
Members who bring an enormous amount of experience to the investigatory process, and I think they also reflect in their person the fact that this is an international investigation, which sometimes those of us in the United States seem to forget. The findings, before we get to the shouldn't be lost when you're considering our work. First of all, this is an interim report. It is not the whole story by a long shot. It is divided into two parts, a very detailed investigatory record. Now, it does cover some interesting and pertinent questions, and I think it does reveal some institutional vulnerabilities, particularly in the area of procurement of certain UN contractors. That is part of the subject of the report. We have investigative mandate and national scope, and I think it reflects the work of a really dedicated and skilled professional staff. Happens to be drawn from 28 different countries. That, of course, was a time the program started in a hurry. There were political sensitivities. And I can tell you, you will see from the record there was a lot of internal debate. But in the end, the prescribed rules and regulations for procurement were overridden. It's always been fully disclosed in the public record, as you would expect in publications in the USA. It's also never been a part of my standard mile for a simple reform. And then unless it maintains high standards of integrity, it will not be able to command the support of member states and the world's public. Now, it may also be relevant that 12 or 13 years ago, I co-chaired a board foundation study of UN finances. So I went back and looked at it. Here's my microphone. What do we...